forces, often with those settlers, of course, protected by those same forces. There is a political dimension to this heightened violence against Palestinians. It's partly reaction to the rise, the effectiveness, the popularity of the Lion's Den group based in Nablus, where at least some of the Israeli state's violence has been concentrated, in combination with the pressures of parliamentary elections in Israel itself. Internationally, only yesterday, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's Middle East tour ended, I think. And by my reckoning, that involved no new policies from Israel's biggest sponsor, or even any change in rhetoric, as it seemed to me. As I've said, I'll keep my introduction short, given the expertise of all the speakers. To explain the format of this evening's discussion and to introduce each speaker, I propose in the order in which they speak. I'll begin with Hafid Al-Ghawel, who's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Tim Maruthi, who's the head of program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, and a professor of African Studies at the Centre for African Studies at the University of the Free State in South Africa, of course. Third, Sarah Flanders, who's an American political writer. Fourth, Ubay Al-Aboudi, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who's the executive director of the Bisan Center for Research and Development, which is itself based in Ramallah. Our fifth speaker is Adam Shapira, who's the director of advocacy for Israel-Palestine at Democracy for the Arab World Now, a think tank in DC. Sixth will be Qadri Abu Bakr, who's the chairman of the Palestinian Detainees and Ex-Detainees Affairs Commission. Seventh is Jim Moran, a former longtime congressional representative for Virginia's 5th, and who has chaired the New Democrat Coalition for a number of years. And last but by no means least, Ruba As-Salibi, who recently completed a PhD in cultural studies from the University of Exeter and is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford. And I've been told that Dr. As-Salibi will speak on Gaza in particular. As I've said, a number of speakers tonight, and so I'd like to suggest that each person speaks for approximately 10 minutes, give or take a minute or two. And with that being said, if I can ask Mr. Al-Ghawel if he'd like to take the floor.
Please open your mic. Your mic is closed.
Yes, hello.
My apologies. That always happens to me. I said thank you very much, Joe, and thanks to the Organization for Human Rights in Britain. And hello to everybody who's joining us, both speakers and the audience, whoever is watching. Wherever you are, depending on your time zone. I'm in Washington, D.C., and it's 12 o'clock here in the afternoon. The issue of what Israel has been doing in general in the occupied territories since practically its inception, and then even so after 67, is nothing new. And I think it is something that the world has become almost callous about, and there's hardly any reactions from anybody anymore about all the abuses and violations that are taking place against the Palestinians almost on daily and weekly basis. Some of it makes it to the news whenever there is some dead or serious violence, but the abuses are continuous, and most of them are not really apparent. Palestinians face these abuses on daily basis, going to work or going to school or trying to find their food, or the humiliations they endure every day is a continuous thing. And that's really a statement on multiple levels. It is a statement on the real failure of the international order in general to deal even with the most famous, if not the most urgent conflict that we've had in the last 70, 80 years in the world. And it also speaks about how the balance of power determines even the basic human rights of people. And there are differences between humans. Some humans seem to be worthy of more sympathy and action than others. It's also a statement about the courage and the endurance of the Palestinians. As a friend of mine here, a scholar told me, an American scholar told me once after she visited the occupied territory, she goes, after seeing it on the ground, I'm no longer shocked about the acts of violence that we hear about on the news from the side of the Palestinians, or what they've been calling terrorism. I am actually shocked how little of it is actually happening, given the conditions under which they live. I think right now there's really no use for Palestinians or for anybody who's sympathizing with Palestinians to wait for any reaction from the international community or the international order. I think their reactions have amply showed that they are not interested, they don't care, that their way of dealing with this is really based on the issue of power that Israel exercises, and especially on the United States government. I think the protection that Israel has enjoyed from various U.S. governments since its inception has given it almost impunity against anything it does. Really, at this point, it doesn't matter what Israel will do or can do or is willing to do. They will always be protected, mainly by the United States, but also to a great extent by the international community, at least by its silence. Add to this picture, I think things have gotten far more complicated, because now you have a number of Arab governments, unfortunately, willing to sell essentially, I mean, let's not be so diplomatic about it, but sell the Palestinians and their cause in exchange for some, in my mind, trivial gains in politics. Many of these Arab governments that got into this, what's called the Abrahamic or the Abraham Accord, have done so simply because they figured that the easiest way to control Washington or to get to Washington is through Tel Aviv. And they have used the Israelis as a way to influence Washington when it comes to various issues they care about. That was led, unfortunately, by an Arab government in the Abu Dhabi. That's the government that worked very hard, publicly and privately, to lead other Arab countries into recognizing Israel and giving it sort of this almost political and legal and a moral blanket that allows it to say, well, we are having peace with the Arabs. The Arabs don't really, they're not complaining about what's happening. We are fighting for our existence, and all of the stuff we all hear. I think it has become a very major contribute. This Arab regional politics has contributed to a great deal for that. I mean, we saw today that the foreign minister of Israel is in Sudan, for example. We know that Sudan recognized Israel in exchange for basic funding for food. Morocco recognized Israel officially after all these years, even though there was always some kind of a relationship, because it wanted the United States to recognize its territorial claims on Western Sahara. UAE recognized Israel because it wanted to get all kinds of technology to essentially control its own population and interfere with all kinds of Arab activists around the Arab world who are calling for democracy and a change. I mean, we've seen them finance, arm all kinds of characters in Libya, my own country, a retired general who bombed the capital for over a year without anybody talking. In Tunis, they interfered with elections in Sudan, in Somalia, in Syria, you name it. It has been their agenda to try to undermine any of this public upheavals that happen in the Arab world demanding democracy and the rule of law. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think Israel is really wasting a lot of its energy on Arab governments. Nobody can ever claim that these governments represent their people in general, but also specifically on the Palestinian issue. I think anybody who talks to even people in Abu Dhabi will bitterly complain to you about what their government is doing by recognizing Israel. They're afraid to say that publicly, of course, because that means they will disappear. But I think the issue of peace in general for Israel is always going to be elusive, because the problem of Israel is not really with Arab governments. These governments are willing to do anything. They've demonstrated that they're willing to commit atrocities themselves against their own people. Their problem is with the Arab public. And I think as long as Israel does not deal with the Palestinian issue in a proper way, the Arabs as a population will never forgive Israel, and they will never have peace with Israel. So yes, you may have an embassy like we see in Cairo, where it's empty pretty much, nobody's there, with just a flag on a building. But that does not mean there is a peace between Egypt and Israel. The same thing pretty much everywhere. The populations reject that simply because of what they see is happening to the Palestinian people. And I think any search for peace for Israel has to start with their dealing with the Palestinians. That's the only way they're going to gain any respect or acceptance or tolerance even from the rest of the Arab world. The issue of violence and what is happening, I think the Palestinians need to recognize and know with no doubt of any kind that the international order is not going to give them justice. The international order does not respect their humanity. No international organization is going to ever care about them. And that they are basically subject to the whims of how radical this Israeli government or the next one. We are now experiencing the worst radical government in the history of Israel itself. And I think that's going to continue. There has to be another way. I think the only thing that people who sympathize with Palestinians need to do is to figure out specific tools that they could advise them with that can circumvent all of this nonsense in the international order, and give them tools that they can themselves use with the support of others in Europe, in the United States, in the Arab world, and the Islamic world in general, that they could help them defend themselves and take legal action or demonstration or civil disobedience or whatever to actually have their voices heard. Other than that, I don't see any real solution to this. There is never going to be an Israeli that's going to be put in front of a court. There is never going to be any international court or legal or agreement that will ever somehow help the Palestinians in the face of Israel. And I think the best thing we all can do is figure out ways to help them, other than just complaining about it and putting their story on the news. It's been happening 60 years. Nothing happened. I think it's about enough time to really reach the conclusion that we need another way. These are my 2 cents so far.
And thank you so much for that powerful summary. I think especially the distinction between the states of the Arabic-speaking world and the peoples is crucial to maintain. Our next speaker is Professor Murithi. Excuse me if I've mispronounced it. Professor, off to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Cape Town, South Africa. Yes, my name is Professor Tim Murithi with the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, based in Cape Town. So I think we meet under very solemn conditions, very difficult situation for all the Palestinians in the occupied territories, and also with global attention diverted, obviously, due to the multiple global crises, but in particular, I would say the Russian-Ukraine crisis has sucked a lot of energy out of an international, so-called international community, which we can even question whether it still exists. I mean, I can comment on the historical parallels between the current situation in Palestine, the occupied territories, and the historic situation in South Africa, apartheid South Africa. Then comment a little bit about the Israel's intensive lobbying on the African continent, which Professor, my previous speaker, Afed, mentioned briefly, and then talk about some challenges on the ground and potentially maybe sketch what a renewed global campaign could look like, because that in the end is all that we have, with everything else seemingly paralyzed. And so the historical parallels with South Africa are quite clear. I think South African apartheid system was a very brutal system of racial segregation and institutionalized racism on the basis of white supremacy. And it created a two-tier system, a multiple-tier system, but at least a two-tier system, with restricted movements, what we're seeing today, the checkpoints in the occupied territories, the establishment of restrictions that prevent normal human functioning in effect, going to school, going to a hospital, having access to work, those basic needs that all human beings have, very much alive and well today in the 21st century Israel and the occupied territories, and the active role of the Israeli government to actually work behind the scenes to establish military and economic links with countries that it can identify is not new. The South African apartheid system did exactly the same thing with even African governments on the African continent and established military economic links. So this is not a new playbook at all. Israel actively campaigned and eventually received and obtained observer status at the African Union. Palestine has always had a very long-standing, observer status in the African Union, but recently in 2021, Israel achieved the same goal, which created a lot of kind of brouhaha on the African continent, and it led to heads of state on the African continent, in fact, convening and reviewing this view. It appears that it wasn't a decision that was taken by the member states of the African Union. It was a decision that was taken by the chairperson of the African Union, Musa Faki Mahamat, in July 2021, almost a unilateral decision to grant Israel observer status, and Tel Aviv had been lobbying for almost 20 years. And many African countries actually stood up when they saw this and said, this actually is maybe in contravention with even South Africa's historical struggle with colonialism and occupation, and was not in line with the ethos of the African Union. And it became a real live issue at the level of the heads of state. And it was therefore agreed that the decision would be suspended and that a new committee would deliberate on whether Israel should continue to be accredited. And the specific countries that opposed accreditation were Algeria, Nigeria, and South Africa, while others did support, like Cameroon, Democratic Congo, Rwanda. You've just had that, countries like Sudan are also receiving preferential treatment from Israel. So there is an ongoing diplomatic war, if so to speak. The African Union has issued statements, which, in and of themselves are not sufficient, but they can serve as advocacy and lobbying instruments. In the 7th of August, 2022, the chairperson of the African Union, the same chairperson that we're criticizing, she issued a statement that strongly condemned the air attacks by Israel in Gaza that killed more than 30 Palestinians, including 6 children, and called for the usual diplomatic statements about upholding international law and unwavering support of the African Union. That would have been more of a collective statement that came from the wider AU system rather than an individual one. But you see, so we have all this interesting elements happening within across the African continent. In terms of, I think what key elements that some aspects of what we work on at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation are the importance of ensuring and working on maintaining the psychosocial support to the victims and the survivors in the affected communities in the occupied territories. That's easier said than done. I know everyone within that region within those territories is significantly affected by what is happening. But in South Africa, it was very similar, and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who led the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, often spoke about the need for wounded healers to, in fact, continue to carry the burden of helping their fellow citizens to survive the brutal assault of the apartheid state. And I think in the occupied territories, it has to be a similar approach to addressing these issues. We work also in the field of transitional justice, and in the absence of a peace agreement or a ceasefire agreement even, what civil society actors can do is ensure they're actually documenting what's happening. I believe this is already happening in the occupied territories, but also mapping out what transitional justice strategies look like going forward. There was a mention of an international or a global tribunal, but the other options there are a range of options in transitional justice. It shouldn't be exclusively looking at the courts, because particularly when a government is oppressive and using brutal force and has no intention of relinquishing, which was in fact the case in South Africa. Another model is to look at how do you put in place alternative processes of transitional justice, truth documentation of the atrocities, calling upon the perpetrators to come forward and actually acknowledge what they've done and use that as a basis to help the society to move forward. So it sounds harder. It sounds much harder than the way I'm describing it. It did happen in South Africa, and it does not exclude the possibility of happening other parts of the world. And to conclude, I think a renewed global campaign is absolutely necessary, with the eyes of the world diverted in so many different directions. A renewed global campaign that's cross-cutting across different continents, I think, is definitely necessary. And I believe this is what the Arab Organization for Human Rights is currently trying to advocate for and push by also convening us on this platform. So I'll leave it there, Joe, and then we can obviously pick it up in conversation as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, and exactly 10 minutes. And so thanks again. Our next speaker is Sarah Flanders.
Okay. Hello, and thank you, and thanks to the Organization for Human Rights for hosting this honest discussion. I'm a contributing editor to Workers' World News, and I coordinate the work of the International Action Center. But over years, the question is always asked how to end the violence. And I think it's important to always state right up front, the only way to end the violence is to end the occupation. This is endless violence, and it is perpetrated because of the ironclad US support for Israel, an apartheid state. And more, there has to be attention on the extent of this aid, political, diplomatic. The visit of the US Secretary of State, Blinken, during this latest crisis, there he is standing hand in hand with Netanyahu, saying that they share core principles. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Principles of apartheid and racism and theft of land, genocide. But he's grandly stating we share core principles, we're partners stressed again and again. There's no interest, of course, in any sort of a peace plan. That's sheer hypocrisy. But I think that the focus on what is the extent of US aid to Israel needs to have attention every time. More than $3.3 billion a year. Israel is the largest recipient of aid in the world. And weapons, the most advanced weapons, and also funding to the Israeli arms industry. Now, $3.3 billion a year, $10 million a day, every day for 75 years. It's astronomical. It exceeds any amount of money you can think anywhere in the world or any country. Of course, there's every form of diplomatic support, whether in the UN, to countries around the world. It's because the US stands behind Israel in every one of these crimes that more and more extremist, right-wing, really fascist governments can be put into place because they know there's no cost to them. There's nothing that the US will do. They might wring their hands a bit once in a while. Now, Netanyahu came into office this latest time, promising to establish more settlements in the occupied territories and to normalize relations, Saudi Arabia and other states, to continue this process of normalization, which is an absolute fraud, while continuing ethnic cleansing on a massive scale, the expropriation of homes, more checkpoints, more separate roads, and definitely at every step, more political prisoners. The amount of US aid to Israel, it needs to be a focus of every campaign. It needs to be called out again and again, because Israel could not exist one day without these billions and billions of dollars cumulatively adding up. And in a real way, we ask ourselves, what is the purpose of this? It's in US interest to divide the entire region, keep countries poor and fighting each other. That's in US interests. It's in the interests of US oil corporations and banking and weapons and war industries. It's completely linked in every form. Now, there have been countless UN resolutions in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, even UN Security Council resolution. The US abstains and goes right ahead partnering with Israel. So we need to call this out. We need to draw attention to this. We need to say the extent of just how flagrant the violations are and the funding is, the funding, the weaponizing of this violence, the support for this violence, the exchange of technology, the training of the police, the Israeli police train US police, and we have the greatest violence right here in the US, 3 police killings a day, every day. So the violence continues, and more ultra-right extremists continue. The attack on Jenin is just the latest attack on Jenin. The continuing shootings, roundups, raids, prisoners. This meeting today, so important because it's, as I say, it's an honest discussion. You won't see that in the US corporate media. Every single article begins and ends with condemning Palestinian violence, talking about concern, a total fraud. So I think that's my one point of the day. It's usually my point is to talk about 3.3 billion a year, every year, $10 million a day, every day for 75 years, weapons endlessly and support endlessly. Thank you for this discussion. Let's really stand with Palestinian resistance that has also continued through all of these steps. And let's continue the support for the Palestinian prisoners who fill the jails and their resistance that continues generation to generation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I agree that the link is indeed crucial, perhaps the most crucial point of the discussion. Our fourth speaker is Ubay Al-Ubaudi. I hope I pronounced that correctly, who's the Executive Director of the Bisan Center for Research and Development, again, based in Ramallah.
Thank you, Joe. It's Al-Aboudi.
Al-Aboudi, excuse me.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, and thank you for having us convey our voices and our concerns in this open discussion. I'd like to thank all the previous speakers, especially Sarah, which laid it out, the issue of complicity. I think this is one of the major issues that is not just contributing to the continued colonization and human rights violations of Palestine, but also of human rights violations globally. And bringing, as civil society, bringing accountability and shedding light. I think this is shedding light on the issues is the first step towards bringing accountability to those that would be, I would say, would be the human rights violators that would be, as we believe, down the road would be held accountable. Bisan Center for Research and Development is a Palestinian think tank that was established back in 1988. This is even before the establishment of the PA, the Palestinian Authority. We started our formal registrations in 1989. And funny enough, we had the first registration was with the Israeli authorities according to the Ottoman laws. which were in effect until today, actually, these laws, as they are the continuation of the Ottoman and British mandate that was on Palestine, historic Palestine. Bisan, from the get-go, worked on promoting a different paradigm for development that is inclusive for everyone, that targets and tries to disentangle asymmetrical power relations, whether they were gender-based, colonial-based, racism, whatever, capitalism, whatever the source of those asymmetrical power relations, towards a more inclusive development for all. And we have been able to work with all of the restrictions that we faced for the past 33, 34 years by producing critical research and then operationalizing this research by working with CBOs and volunteer groups and youth movements in order to enact change, whether it was at the local or national level. And a couple of years ago, we also started doing international advocacy on the issue of Palestine and the socioeconomic rights of the Palestinians. Since the designation, which has been more than a year right now, and the systematic targeting, which started actually much earlier than the designation. As Bisan, we can remember the targeting even at the height of the first Intifada, where any kind of Palestinian organizing was targeted. And when we talk about Bisan, we talk about also Palestinian civil society, because this is a small example of the larger civil society that we are, of course, we adopt a human rights-based approach, but we are also Palestinian. So we are part of the Palestinian community, and our initiation and our start was through a group of volunteers. This is how civil society here started, that wanted to enact change in the specific fields or expertise they had, whether it was legal, like in the cases of Al-Haq or Al-Damir, or agricultural, like in the case of Union of Agriculture Work Committees, or in our case, doing academic research. Of course, the targeting of the 6 organizations and the larger Palestinian civil society is a part of the Israeli annexation plans that have been ongoing, not since 1996, the first rise of Netanyahu into power, nor has it been ongoing since the last government. This has been a current Israeli practice since 1967. They wanted to control the occupied Palestinian territories with as little people as possible and having control over land and enacting their laws and I would say Israeli sovereignty over the Palestinian resources, Palestinian borders, Palestinian lives, even our lives. Of course, the targeting that happened to the organizations, the Israelis were very blatant about it. There's an open report everyone can access on the Israeli Knesset's websites that talks about the importance of targeting foreign-funded organizations as part of the Israeli overall strategy of maintaining control over Area C lands. So the targeting of the organizations was part, because these organizations, our work, we document Israeli human rights violations. This is on the one level. We disseminate this results globally. This is on the second level. And on the third level, we also help in the steadfastness of the people, because not all organizations just do the documentation and the dissemination, but we also provide, some of the organizations also provide services. And Bisan, I would say, is at an intersection between the documentation and the research, and also providing some services and working with youth groups and CBOs, community-based organizations, in order to counteract the Israeli impacts over their lives. Because when you're talking about the counteracting of these impacts, just look at the Israeli administrative laws that they have, military orders that have been signed since 1967. Around 80% of those laws that have been signed have an economic aspect and impact to them. What is the reason behind it? The reason is maintain, first of all, to disintegrate the economic and social relationships between the different Palestinian communities in the OPT, and create these kinds of relationships between the different communities disintegrated with the Israeli centers that are closer to them. So one of the things that, for example, Palestinians are not allowed to do is getting our water, which has been documented by research by BISAN and other organizations and even the UN. 85% of our water in the West Bank and Gaza, we have zero access to, and we are forbidden to access to. While cities, for example, Palestinian villages might endure 40 days without running water and have to procure it from different locations at high cost. Israeli settlements living next to them will be able to operate pools and operate and have 4 or 5 times, and even some cases 100 times more available water than their Palestinians, the natives living on their own lands. For the work of the civil society, of course, the pressure has been mounting, and there has been also, I would say, complicity from some international actors. Although we heard clear statements from governments that there is no evidence, that the evidence is not convincing, that what they saw does not amount to criminalization of civil society, but nonetheless, we have seen also other countries remain silent, especially the United States, with all of its power and all of its hegemony over the financial and global system. On a second level, we have seen also de-risking by banks, de-risking by some organizations that are saying, okay, it has become too risky to operate with, not all organizations, of course, but some organizations, too risky to operate with the Palestinian civil society, especially if it's highly targeted like this. On the other hand, we have also seen a lot of solidarity from internationals and from locals in the face of the Israeli violations. The other day, human rights organizations, we organized a field trip to human rights defenders to document what is happening in refugee camp. There were over 40 organizations participating in it. We saw what is happening. We talked with the people on the ground. We understand that what is being targeted now is not just a single aspect of Palestinian community, but what is targeted is the entirety of the presence and being Palestinian. We are targeted for being Palestinian. The civil society is targeted for promoting the Palestinian narrative locally, preserving it, and internationally. What we request from the international community, and this is, I think, really simple. We don't request aid. We don't request support. What we request is putting pressure on governments and businesses to stop being accomplices to Israeli war crimes. Whether it was the funding of the Israeli military, you are giving weapons to killers, and then you are telling me that you are not accountable. Of course, you are aiding and abetting crime, murder, occupation, colonialism. If you are a 501c3 status, like some of the Israeli organizations that we documented with other partners that have charity status in the United States that are funding violent right-wing settlers that are coming, burning the lands of Palestinians, attacking Palestinians, their homes, committing crimes on a daily basis, then don't tell me that your government is not complicit. Don't tell me that your business that is donating for those organizations is not complicit. This is complicity. What we are requesting from the world, whether it was especially the global West or the global North, let us say, if it's in the United States or if it's in Europe, to stop being accomplices to human rights violations. And we rely and have hopes on the people putting pressure on their governments to have change of policies. Because in the end, when the occupation becomes more costly than it is beneficial for the occupiers, then the occupation will end.
Thank you very much. And I've left a link for the Bisan Center in the chat there. Our next speaker is Adam Shapiro. He, again, is the Director of Advocacy for Israel-Palestine at Dawn, or the Democracy for the Arab World Now. Adam, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you to all my predecessor speakers on this call who've delivered a really important overview and insight into what's going on. I just want to pick up on Ubey's last point there about what Palestinians are asking for from the international community. And I think what's worth noting is that the request about accountability is oftentimes, and I would even argue most times, not about doing something extraordinary. And as far as the United States goes, as far as the UN system, as far as other countries, it's perfectly already within the boundaries of law, of what's already written on the books. It's really a question of political will and implementation. And just to give you a quick example that which ties into also the media narrative on some of this stuff, which is what I was also asked to speak about. If we take the case of Palestinian-American Omar Assad, an 80-year-old man who was killed a year ago in January 2022, the initial report about his killing, he was detained at a checkpoint in his own village by Israeli soldiers. He was blindfolded, gagged, and bound, had his arms bound, his hands bound, and left in an abandoned construction site for a home for a few hours in the middle of the night. And then ultimately, when the soldiers left, they released him and the other people who were being detained, and he ended up dying as a result of the treatment he experienced. He suffered a stress-induced heart attack, which caused his death. Initially, the reporting on that was that it was tragic, that he was an old man, that he had he was of poor health, and that while the soldiers could have done something in terms of checking on him, ultimately it was just an unfortunate incident. On our side, what we did was investigate that further, and actually were able to determine and provide information to the United States government, to the State Department, that it was the actions of the soldiers which were illegal according to Israeli army procedures. They are not allowed, soldiers are not, this will be news to a lot of people, but Israeli soldiers are not allowed to blindfold Palestinian detainees when they're being held for the purposes of detention, not for arrest. So somebody who's just being held at a checkpoint for a while, which happens all the time, they're actually not, there's no allowance according to military guidelines and rules of procedure for them to be blindfolded. Nonetheless, this happens all the time. The point is that in Omar Assad's case, it was determined that his blindfolding and his gagging and being bound all were what caused the stress that led to his heart attack. So it was actual concrete actions taken by Israeli soldiers that were the proximate cause of death. That would be manslaughter at the very least, if not murder, in most jurisdictions around the world. Presenting that information to the State Department, to what we have is the Leahy Law, which some people might be familiar with, which allows for the US government to stop military assistance to foreign military units that receive US military assistance and training. All that we were asking for and all that is required for the US government at that point is to investigate and implement, if the investigation confirms our findings, implement the law that's already on the books. It doesn't require inventing a new law. It doesn't require inventing a new reason to look at Israel specifically. This is a law that applies to all countries around the world. We know that in this case, the US State Department is asking questions, and we've seen some repercussions as a result. The reporting on his killing has changed in the media. The way that the US government considers the killing of Omar Assad now is as a killing and not as a unfortunate or accidental death. And we're now waiting to see whether or not there will be further measures of accountability. But this ultimately gets at the larger picture of what is going on. Palestinians and their supporters around the world have figured out and are using these tools of accountability, of pressure, whether it's boycott, divestment, and sanctions, whether it's filing claims at the International Criminal Court, whether it's bringing cases like the Leahy Law, whether it's applying to appealing to investment firms and whatnot to apply their own standards on human rights and due diligence when they're looking about investments, whether it's from private funds or from sovereign wealth funds. All of these tools of the so-called liberal international order that President Biden touts as the fundamental reason for why the United States is doing what it's doing in Ukraine are being used and attempted to be used by Palestinians and their supporters. And all that they're asking for is something very banal. Apply the same basic rules and regulations that you apply to everything else to our case. A case that, as Sarah previously mentioned, is the unique case in the world where, in terms of US military and financial support, in terms of UN resolutions not being implemented, et cetera, et cetera. And what we're seeing as a result of that utilization of these mechanisms by the Palestinians is, number one, we are seeing a narrative change in the media and in the portrayal of the conflict. I mean, it's still not the way we perhaps want it to be, and we still have plenty of scope for criticism and critique of the media. But there is a tangible change if you look at the way the media covers the conflict today. And I speak about the media as one big thing, but it's obviously not one big thing, it's individual actors. But even in some of the most egregious spaces, like the New York Times, BBC, I think we can actually discern differentiation, both in terms of who they bring on to speak and who they interview, and also who is actually doing the reporting. And perhaps some of that was unfortunately assisted by the fact of the killing and seeming impunity of Al Jazeera colleague Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian-American journalist who was assassinated, targeted and assassinated. In response to, and I should say, we should understand all of these actions as resistance, that this is all part of the big package of resistance that Palestinians are offering and their supporters are offering to the Israeli occupation, colonization, apartheid, all of it. And in some ways, this is the bigger challenge to Israel. I would argue, and I've argued this for a long time, that regardless of what we think about Palestinian militant action, armed action, in some ways, it's the easiest thing for Israel to deal with. In part because it receives so much weaponry and assistance from the United States and other places. The harder thing, the more difficult thing, and the thing that enables Palestinians to build greater support around the world is these other forms of resistance, these other types of actions, running the gamut of nonviolent resistance from on-the-ground protesting and opposition to bureaucratic measures trying to be implemented around the world. And that's where we're seeing a full-on Israeli assault now in an attempt to sort of catch up and stop what has been many successful initiatives, whether it's, again, the boycotting and divestment strategies that have led to companies pulling out of their engagement in Israel in terms of investments or in terms of operations, including one of the biggest successes of Veolia, but even something a little bit maybe not as economically important, but certainly symbolically important, of Ben & Jerry's taking the action that it took, to things like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, basically disinvesting from companies that are on the UN list of companies that are investing and benefiting from the occupation. There are countless more examples happening around the world. And what Israel and its allies are trying to do now is to criminalize that, and trying to do that through the introduction of the next tool in its arsenal, which is the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And we're seeing that through the adoption of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, an attempt to criminalize any speech, any kind of activity that dares to question what Israel is doing. But they're not satisfied in some ways with just doing that. They're now trying, the effort to deploy these tactics is also being extended to also shut down other types of activities that are intersectional with the occupation and support of Israel, which have to do with challenging companies on climate change and their involvement in policies that are advancing climate change. The same tactics to shut down BDS in the United States are being used to shut down boycott, divestment, sanctions of fossil fuel companies, using copy-paste tactics to apply what was used to shut down Palestinian, or attempt to shut down Palestinian activism, to now shut down climate activism. The result is, though, that we're finding greater and greater support and solidarity between the climate change the opposition to climate change, that movement, and the Palestinian movement, because of they're put in the same position of being targeted by these same kind of actors. And this is happening on a global scale. So I certainly don't want to paint a rosy picture. It's not a rosy picture, and what Palestinians are facing today is as has been mentioned, is in some ways unprecedented. But bear in mind that what Israel is going through right now is, in a sense, the chickens coming home to roost. It is the case that the settler movement that was largely enabled and supported by successive Israeli governments and by the United States and others, and they were happy to see them, expand and conquer territory and conquer Palestinians in the West Bank. Well, that settler movement has grown up and recognized and decided it wants power in Israel, inside the government, and to determine the policies of the state for its own citizens, not just for how it operates in terms of the occupied territories. And that's starting to scare people. That's starting to scare Israelis. That's starting to scare even the Americans. And I think because of that, we're at a very interesting juncture in history, which is, again, extremely dangerous for Palestinians, but also an opportunity for us in the movement to support Palestine to push harder and to push this tipping point over. I'll stop over there and leave the rest for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks as ever, Adam, for your contribution. Our next speaker is Qadri Abu Bakr, who's the chairman of the Palestinian Detainees and Ex-Detainees Affairs Commission. I understand that Qadri will be speaking through a translator.
سيد قدري افتح الميكروفون لو سمحت. تحدث جملة وستقوم المترجمة بترجمة كلام حضرتك.
الحديث هم بدهم يقتصر على الأسرى ولا على إيش؟
تحدث في سياق الموضوع، نتحدث عن العنف الإسرائيلي تجاه الشعب الفلسطيني وتجاه أسر الأسرى وما إلى ذلك، والقتل الممنهج من السلطات الإسرائيلية على الفلسطينيين.
نعم. يعني أول شيء شكرا على الاستضافة. بعدين أنا بدي أحكي على الأسرى، يعني من ذو الاحتلال من 67 حتى يومنا هذا دخل سجون الاحتلال أكثر من 1,100,000 فلسطيني، هذا حسب المسجلين رسميا. نعم أكمل.
First of all, Major General Qadri would like to speak about Palestinian prisoners, and he says, first of all, thank you for having me tonight. And since the beginning of the occupation until now, more than 1,100,000 people have been detained.
نعم، يعني أنا بدي أحكي الأسرى والشهداء، عشرات الآلاف من الشهداء الذين سقطوا هم فقط نتيجة المقاومة الفلسطينية للاحتلال الموجود على أرض فلسطين. لولا الاحتلال لما هناك في لا شهداء ولا جرحى ولا أسرى. الأساس عندنا هو احتلال للأرض الفلسطينية.
Since the beginning of the occupation, tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed, and it was only for the resistance for the occupation. Shouldn't it not be for the occupation, there wouldn't be people who are killed, injured, or people who are still detained.
إسرائيل تتعامل مع الأسرى الفلسطينيين ليس كمدنيين وليس كمجرمين، يعني كمجرمين، والأساس أنه يتم التعامل معهم كأسرى حرب، لكن ليس لديهم أي حقوق لدى حكومة الاحتلال، وفقط هناك القمع والإرهاب داخل سجون الاحتلال.
Israel is not treating the Palestinian prisoners as civilians nor as criminals. They are supposed to be treated as war hostages, and they have rights and so on. However, the Israeli authorities deprive them of all their rights, and it suppresses them, and it uses terrorism against them.
الآن السجون تمر بأسوأ حالاتها، خاصة وأن وزير الأمن الداخلي هو بن غفير الذي قبل الانتخابات قالوا له أنت، قال أنا بدي أرشح حالك. لماذا؟ قال لأنتقم من هؤلاء الأسرى المخربين القتلة. يعني برنامجه الانتخابي كان إنه بده يستلم وزارة الأمن الداخلي لينتقم من هؤلاء الأسرى، وهكذا تم. في نتيجة إعلانه لهيك أخذ أصوات عالية جدا، لأنه برنامجه ضد الأسرى وضد الفلسطينيين والقتل والقمع الفلسطيني.
The prisons now are the worst, and the Minister of Security, of Internal Security, bin Ghafir, his electoral program was about how he would like to run the prisons of the Israelis to actually take revenge of the Palestinians, and this was the only reason that he succeeded in his electoral program and got elected.
يعني بن غفير هو مسؤول الشرطة، وسموتريتش اللي هو وزير المالية أيضا بدأوا في عقوبة الأسرى، وليس عقوبة على الأسرى وإنما على أهالي الأسرى، في قطع المخصصات اللي تقدم لهم من خلال المقاصة الفلسطينية اللي بتجنيها إسرائيل نيابة عن الفلسطيني وهي ضرائب. وهذه المقاصة هي من حق الشعب الفلسطيني، لكن بيقتطعوا هذه الرواتب، مع العلم إنه إسرائيل تسمح للعائلات الفلسطينية أن يدفعوا كانتين للأسرى أبنائهم ما يعادل $1000، بالوقت اللي إحنا بنصرف 400 أو 500 دولار للعائلات. هذه هم بيقتطعوها، ممنوع. من وين يجيبوا الأسرى؟ هذا هو الازدواجية بالنسبة للاحتلال.
Bin Ghafir, as well as the head of the Israeli police and the Minister of Finance, are practicing the worst type of torture or of revenge against the Palestinian prisoners as well as their families, and they're refusing to give them the money or the aids that are supposed to make their families survive.
منذ أن تسلم بن غفير حكومة الأمن الداخلي زار سجن نفحة، ومن هناك انطلقت العملية المخطط الإسرائيلي أو المخطط بن غفير، حيث تم نقل العشرات بل المئات من الأسرى من سجن إلى سجن، وأثناء النقل تم مصادرة ممتلكاتهم وحتى أغراضهم الشخصية، الدخان والسجائر هذا، وصودرت وأدخل. يعني على سبيل المثال تم نقل 40 أسير من سجن ريمون إلى سجن جلبوع، دخلوا المعتقل بدون ما يدخلوا ممتلك يعني أمتعتهم، وناموا ليلة كاملة بدون حتى البطانيات أو الإحرامات، وصادروا كل ممتلكاتهم. وكذلك الأمر هذا حصل في كل السجون، التنقلات شبه يومي بتتم بالعشرات بل من المئات، وهناك القمع داخل السجون.
Since bin Ghafir took place, he visited Nafha prison and started moving tens of Palestinian prisoners from one prison to another. The Israeli authorities confiscated all their belongings and even their personal stuff, including the cigarettes, and they just started moving them from one prison to another on a daily basis. 40 people were transferred from Rimon to Jalboa prison without their personal belongings, even without having the blankets in this cold winter.
قبل يومين تم اقتحام معتقل البنات اللي هو في داخل السجون، والبنات عندنا 29 امرأة وفتاة، منهم 2 قاصرات. تم اقتحام السجن، ضرب بالغاز المسيل للدموع وغاز الفلفل، وتم عزل ممثلة المعتقلات، وهناك فرض عقوبات على الأسيرات بشهر ممنوع الزيارة، شهر ممنوع التليفون، وبالإضافة إلى أسبوع زنزانة انفرادية لكل أسير داخل المعتقل.
Two days ago, the females' prisons was attacked, and we have 29 female prisoners in the Israeli prisons, including 2 minors, and they threw paper cans as well as tear gas cans against them, and they also sent the representative to solitary confinement. They deprived them from receiving visitations, family visitations for a whole month, or using the phone, and they also will keep each one of them in a solitary confinement for 1 week.
عندنا بالسجون عدة ملفات. الملف الأول هو ملف المحكومين إداري، اللي فيش عنده تهمة، فيش عنده اعتراف، فيش عنده لائحة اتهام، يزج بالسجن لفترات طويلة. الحاكم هذول مسؤولين عند الحاكم العسكري. كان العام الفائت كان عدد الأسرى لا يتجاوز 500 أسير. حاليا نحكي إحنا عن 860 أسير محكومين إداري، ويجدد الحكم الإداري لهم تلقائي، لدرجة إنه في من الأسرى أمضوا 7 و8 سنوات أحكام إداري يعني متجددة تلقائيا، وهذا مشكلة بحد ذاتها. هذه الملف الإداري. عندنا ملف المرضى كمان.
لحظة الترجمة.
We have different files, including the file of the administrative detention, which is renewed automatically and could extend to 7 and 8 years non-stop, since we have people of the prisoners who have spent such sentences. We have 860 prisoners who are detained administratively under the military ruler.
عندنا الملف الآخر ملف المرضى. عندنا حوالي 700 أسير مريض بأمراض مختلفة، منهم 25 أسير بأمراض السرطان، و8 إلى 9 مرضى في غسيل الكلى، وهناك 8 أسرى مقعدين على الكراسي المتحركة، طبعا شلل كامل. إضافة إلى الأمراض الأخرى، إحنا طالبنا أن يتم فحص دوري للأسرى داخل السجون لو مرة كل 6 شهور. فإذا كان أي أسير مصاب بالسرطان في بدايته ممكن علاجه، لكن الإدارة رفضت بشكل قاطع.
Our other file is about the sick prisoners who do not receive any medical treatment, and we have many people who are now tied to. They are using a wheelchair because they cannot move at all, and almost 700 sick prisoners. Their situation worsens because of the situation of the prison, and some of them actually have cancer without getting any treatment.
سيد قدري، أخيرا لو سمحت حدثنا بإيجاز عن وفيات السجون الإسرائيلية، وفيات الأسرى في السجون الإسرائيلية.
نعم، عندنا اللي يصابوا بالسرطان حتى بيكونوا ماخذين تقرير من مدير المستشفى إنه لم يبقى من حياته إلا أيام، بيرفضوا إطلاق سراحه بدعوى إنه هناك في قرار من الكنيسة بعدم الإفراج المبكر عن أي أسير أمني. وهذا ما حصل مع كثير من الشهداء اللي استشهدوا قبل أشهر، اللي وصل عددهم 11 شهيد داخل السجون، هذول الإصابات بالسرطان. وكان آخرها ناصر أبو حميد اللي قالوا الأطباء إن لم يبقى إلا ساعات، ومع هذا استشهد. والأنكى من ذلك إنه لما يستشهد داخل السجون يرفضوا يسلموا جثمانه لأهله، وهذه عقوبة إضافية تضاف إلى الأهل وليس إلى الشهيد.
Palestinian detainees die in prisons due to cancer, and they refuse to release them, even if the hospitals have requested their release, claiming that the Knesset refuses the early release of any prisoner. And so far there have been 11 people who died of cancer, including, and the last of which is Nasser Abu Hamid, who had only a few hours left. But he still died inside prison, and the authorities, the Israeli authorities, also refused to give the bodies of the dead to their families in a way of just retaliation against the families.
نعم، عندنا ملف آخر حساس أيضا، ملف الأطفال. لدينا في سجون الاحتلال أكثر من 160 طفل ما دون 18 عام. هؤلاء يعني موجودين ب3 سجون، يعاملوا كالرجال، محكومين جزء منهم 20 سنة وأكثر من 20 سنة، يعاملوا معاملة قاسية أيضا. في هناك زي ما ذكرت 13 عام ويحكموا، يعني أجازت المحكمة العسكرية إنه يتم حكم الطفل إذا وصل 14 عام، يحكم في أحكام عالية، وهناك غرامات عالية أيضا تفرض عليهم. وهذه الأشبال، مجموع الأشبال هذول معظمهم، خلينا نقول حوالي 80% منهم من مدينة القدس.
There is also an important file, which is the file of the children. There are 160 child or minor prisoners in 3 prisons in Palestine who are being treated like adults, and who are receiving sentences that goes up to 20 years and more. And the military court has stated that if the minor has reached 14 years old, then they can receive very long sentences in addition to receiving fines. And he stated that 80% of the detained children are from Jerusalem.
جزيلا سيد قدري. شكرا جزيلا.
أهلا وسهلا فيك. شكرا.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Si Qadri. Obviously, very difficult details there, and I'm sure everyone outside Palestine here is in full solidarity with those prisoners, in particular the children you mentioned. Thanks also to the translator Salma, who seems to have done an excellent job. Our second to last speaker, and we thank him for his patience, is Jim Moran, who again is a former congressional representative for Virginia's 8th. Mr. Moran, after you.
Thank you, Joe. And I want to thank all of the speakers on this webinar. I agree with everything that has been said. It's been well said, with one possible exception. Sarah has a deeper explanation for why the U.S. acts as it does toward Israel than I think is warranted. I think the answer is more simplistic than what she ascribes. But let me approach it from 2 angles. We're talking, one, about the cruelty that is imposed upon Palestinians every day. And that wants us to, anybody who watches this that has any kind of objective reaction has to be horrified that the rest of the world would allow this wanton cruelty and oppression to continue, as it has really, as was said, for about 75 years. I do think there's some commonality with the way in which African Americans have been treated in the United States. They, for generations, had been considered the other, if you will, that they were almost subhuman, or certainly not from the same tribe, that they were inferior, and that you could punish them with impunity just to keep them in line. And that persisted for, as we know, for hundreds of years. Finally, in the 60s, there was a civil rights movement, and it was actually I think interestingly, but importantly, it should be noted that much of that civil rights movement was led by young Jewish people who were responding from an understanding of the teachings of the Enlightenment and many of the European philosophers that had much to do with the U.S. approach to human rights. And so it had turned around too slowly, obviously. Now we have a situation where it's being magnified. It's being put in the face and the conscience of the American people. And we're able to use technology. I think now the people who imposed that kind of vicious, consistent cruelty, particularly law enforcement, realize that that's no longer acceptable within our culture. The same thing kind of has to happen with regard to the treatment of Palestinians. I do think with this new government, there's going to be more and more provocative moves taken, knowing that there will be a reaction. As of yesterday, I think there had been 149 people that were described as having lost their lives in this conflict. 29 of them were Israelis. It only takes one, really, to get the kind of overreaction that the right wing, particularly in Israel, wants, because that will continue to lead to more aggression in terms of taking over the West Bank and ultimately much of the Gaza Strip as well. And that's the objective, what they call a greater Israel. They want to push out people that they feel are inferior, frankly, to them and their objectives. So on the one hand, I think maximum visibility, use of technology, and keeping the experience of Palestinians in front of the world's eyes and conscience is necessary. And it needs to be more than Al Jazeera doing that. But then there's a larger issue, and that's the ongoing injustice of what has happened to the Palestinian people, beginning with 750,000 being displaced from their homes and now being treated being kept in an open air prison. It is apartheid. It has some commonality, again, using the US with what happened to indigenous people in North America. They live on reservations now. The best they can hope for is to get a casino and make some money and acquire some power. We can't let that happen to the Palestinian people. So what do we do about it? Well, let me get to Sarah, because I just saw her face pop up. She feels as though keeping the Middle East in a state of conflict and I won't try to paraphrase her words, but it's simpler than that. It's about domestic politics, and it always has been. The majority of people who contribute to the Democratic Party in America have Jewish surnames. Now think about that. The Jewish population in the United States is it's less than 10%. I think at one point it was about 3%. It was about the same as the Muslim population. But the majority of money being contributed to the Democratic Party, and that didn't even include people, Smith, Brown, and so on, who don't have Jewish surnames. And now the same thing has happened with the Republican Party. In fact, just today, about an hour ago, Ilhan Omar was removed from the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House by the Republican majority. Almost all Democrats voted against doing that. problem, again, as I say, is domestic politics. And I think that the way that we deal with this is not by finding fault with the people in the United States whose principal reason for contributing to the political system in America has been the sine qua non of support for Israel, and unqualified support for Israel. That's changing, and it will change. And that is the real hope for what is going to, for future generations. Ironically, but understandably, Bibi Netanyahu's new government is going to facilitate that. What they're doing is intolerable in the judiciary and in other ways. This is not consistent in any way with the majority of people who live in Tel Aviv, and certainly not with the majority of people who are Jewish in the United States, most of whom are secular. They see what's going on. And what's going to have to happen is that Muslim and particularly Arab leaders are going to have to work with the Jewish community, who has found a way to use the American political system. And we have to make sure it's being used in a positive way. I got involved in this, much to my political peril, by a young Jewish activist. As I say, in the 60s, when the civil rights movement was really given birth to, it was young Jewish activists. While I hate to get too ethnic about this, there is a realism here that I think is important to fully understand. This system, even though in the United States, where we have the most wealth, we have the strongest military, and we have the most influence, it's available to anyone. The people who support Israel realize this is the way to ensure Israel's survival and its prosperity. And as several previous speakers have said, it worked. And more than $3 billion a year is provided to subsidize everything the Israeli government does. And then that doesn't even include what's in the black budget, which is larger, and it doesn't include many of the defense contracts that are provided. So there's no question, but all of it is subsidized by the United States. And there's no question that the US government, whether it be Democratic or Republican, does not use that leverage. They do not, because they are afraid to run the risk of losing the support of the community who is most deeply involved in the political process and the most generous. In terms of the Muslim/Arab population, it's almost non-existent. And of the people who do speak up, people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and others, they're too far to the left to have much credibility on other policies or to have the kind of following that they need. And here you have the majority leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, the majority leader of the House up until January, Steny Hoyer, and they have consistently been in Israel's pocket, if you will. That is going to change as a new generation changes. And I think the politics of Israel vis-a-vis the United States is going to change. But what we need is a deliberate strategy to unite young Muslim and Arab activists with young Jewish activists, so that people see this is not an ethnic clash, that this is people united together in pursuit of values that they share. If we don't do that, if we have the kind of divisions that some people would like to see, in the United States for their own purposes and throughout Europe, then I don't think things are going to change. But my guess is that this government is a pivot point. I think Bibi went too far. He was just too ambitious, and he pulled in people to his cabinet that are going to embarrass him every single day. And they could not be less reflective of the founding principles of the Jewish state. Even though I have issues, obviously, in the way that the rest of the world created it, it was formed on the basis of an assumption of democracy and of human rights, and that the people will be judged on the way they treat the other. It is every day it seems to go further away from those founding principles. So I think this is the time for action, but it's got to be action that is concerted, that is well thought out, and that takes advantage of the people who are willing to stand up and speak out for what's right. People who are guided by some of the people on campuses, like Edward Said and others. And when I listened to Adam Shapiro representing Dawn, I'm so glad that Dawn was established. I was somewhat involved in the establishment, and to have leaders like that, it gives me great hope. I think things can change. I think they will change, and I think they must change. So I'll leave it at that. I think I've used up 10 minutes.
Thank you, Jim. And yeah, I just want to quickly address the obviously quite controversial issue of funding in support of pro-Israeli positions, politicians and so on in the US, and the question of Jewishness. And I will simply say that I agree with your emphasizing, firstly, the importance of solidarity across national and religious and ethnic lines and so on. But I think we need to emphasize the important thing is the politics of the money rather than the ethnicity of the people giving it. And I don't know if you'd agree with that, Jim, or if perhaps I mistook what you
Joe,
what you heard.
I'm glad you raised that. Mm-hmm. Being in the Congress for 24 years, mm-hmm. I'm sensitive to what you're saying. Mm-hmm. But in looking where the money went, particularly mm-hmm. to leadership in both parties, mm-hmm. it was a sine qua non. Absolute unqualified support for Israel because there was a clear identification on the mm-hmm. part of people who chose to get involved in politics, and mm-hmm. and Israel was a major motivating reason. Mm-hmm. But their children mm-hmm. are still involved in politics. Mm-hmm. I think it's been wonderful for the United States, frankly. Mm-hmm. I wish we hadn't excluded as many refugees from World War II as we did. Mm-hmm. But those children now have a different perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to use that perspective. You're saying that it's politics, but ethnicity sometimes drives politics. It mm-hmm. did with the Irish, it does with many others. And the diaspora in the United States, wherever they're from, mm-hmm. they have been ruling our political system. Mm-hmm. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt said to Stalin at Malta, he said, "Now I need to talk to you about a domestic political issue that I have to deal with." And Stalin mm-hmm. says, "What's that?" And he said, "Poland." We are a collection of ethnicities. And I don't think that's going to last forever, but right now it's the case, and they do drive politics, and I want them to drive politics toward a more just world, and so that's the reason I mentioned that.
I understand. I understand. Thank you.
And I don't want to sound anti-Semitic, and
I understand.
Palestinians are Semitic people. I'm just saying that let's deal with the political reality in the United States that's driving and reinforcing the injustice that's occurring within Palestine.
Thank you much. And excuse my interruption. Thank you very much, Dr. Saliba, for your patience. Just the briefest recap, Ruba Saliba recently completed a PhD at Exeter University and is now a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford. Ruba, please, after you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the Arab Organization for Human Rights in the UK for organizing this discussion, and thank you for the previous speakers for their important insights, and thanks for inviting me. I guess I want to start by highlighting that the events or the escalation of violence that we've been witnessing in specifically Jenin and Nablus shouldn't be seen in a vacuum, but actually in the context of a continuous settler colonial project and violence in Palestine. My talk will be specifically on Gaza, but I wanted to start with that note because I also feel that Gaza has been often treated as an isolated case that is not connected with other parts of Palestine, but evidently Gaza is a continuation, or the siege on Gaza and the violence that has been inflicted on Gaza is a continuation of that settler colonial violence that has been happening since 1948 and even before that. So what Palestinians have been describing as a Nakba al-Mustamira, or the continuous Nakba, really speaks to this continuous systematic violence that they've been subjected to since even the British Mandate, and then the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine, which destroyed the fabric of the Palestinian society and social life, and scattered them in exile. And and they're still subjected to extreme forms of violence everywhere, whether inside Palestine or in the refugee camps in the neighboring countries and in the diaspora elsewhere. So I want to speak about Gaza from this standpoint as connected to this overall systematic violence of the Israeli settler colonial state. So just last August in 2022, Israel launched an attack on Gaza, which killed 44 Palestinians, including 14 children. And of course, as if the 15 years of crippling siege was not enough. So year after year, actually, the coastal strip has been subjected to horrific aggressions in which thousands have been killed and hundreds of thousands have been injured, and essential infrastructure has been completely destroyed. So back in 2012, actually, the UN has predicted that Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. And by so many measures now in 2023, this prediction has proven right. And yet there are over 2 million people who live in the Strip who face daily an extremely harsh reality and economic deprivation and restrictions on all aspects of daily life. So for 15 years, the siege continues to impose so many restrictions and forms of violence over people in Gaza. So the electricity still goes off for 8 hours a day, sometimes more. The water is unclean and is not suitable for drinking. Traveling in and out of Gaza is extremely hard. But I want to actually specifically highlight the crisis now faced by the health sector due to the siege, and specifically for like the last year now. And according to Gaza's Ministry of Health, Israel has prevented medical diagnostic devices, critical equipment such as mobile and standard X-ray machines, as well as spare parts for such machines from entering Gaza, along with a host of medicines and other medical equipments barred from entry. So Israel's blockade has left Gaza's health sector dramatically undersupplied and in a constant state of a crisis. Israel's medical blockade of Gaza has been described as one that gravely breaches residents' rights to healthcare in Gaza and outside. And this issue is specifically dangerous for cancer patients actually in Gaza, who not only don't have the facilities to be treated inside the Strip, but also permits for them to go to the West Bank to get treatment there, and or in the 48 lands have been so difficult, and so many patients actually die while waiting for these permits to be granted to them. And in many cases, these permits are not given to cancer patients from Gaza. So a lot of them actually die before they get the chance to be treated. And as I said before, the ongoing siege in Gaza and on the Gaza Strip is a continuation of the Israeli settler state violence that aims at targeting the Palestinian presence and the Palestinian body, and a continuation of the Zionist theft of Palestinian land and resources. So the Nakba should not be seen as an event that happened in the past and finished in 1948, but it's actually a continuous structure that aims at the obliteration of the Palestinian presence. They don't want Palestinians to be there. So just the mere fact that you're a Palestinian who lives inside Palestine is enough reason for the Israeli soldiers to kill you. And I want to highlight again that what's happening in Gaza is connected to now what's happening also in Jenin and Nablus and the suppression of the Palestinian resistance. And I want to actually stress what the other speakers have been saying about the need to call on governments to stop selling arms to Israel. And specifically in the UK, actually, because it's where I live and where I work as a Palestinian, and the systematic silencing that Palestinians are facing now in the UK is very dangerous. And I think as institutions and organizations working on human rights, we need to highlight this issue, and we need to stand against the IHRA definition, which equates any criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And we need to fight against this systematic silencing of Palestinians. And we've seen many actually cases where Palestinians who've been vocal about what's happening in Palestine and about the Israeli violence, they've been fired from their places where they work. So this systematic silencing have actually really dangerous ramifications on Palestinians who live in the UK. And I think it's a necessity now to stand against this equation of anti-Semitism with any equation of any criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And I think this is a battle that we need to be fighting here in the UK. And yeah, I think we need also to call on not only on people to support Palestinian resistance in all its forms, whether it was armed resistance or non-armed resistance. And I think even if Palestinians don't resist with arms, they would still be killed. So we need to actually support Palestinians in all ways of resistance that they choose, and we need to support them in whatever way they choose to fight and struggle against this settler colonial regime. And yeah, I think we have we need to call on governments to not only end the siege on Gaza, because and I feel like this has been a forgotten case actually, the siege that has been going on for 15 years, and no one is calling for an end to the siege now, because it's become normalized that Gaza has been under siege, and we shouldn't make this situation normal. And yeah, we need to also call, of course, for an end to the Israeli occupation, because there's not going to be any peace or justice for Palestinians as long as this occupation continues. Thank you so much for inviting me and for everyone who spoke. Thank you.
And thank you very much for your contribution. yeah, in particular, as you say, Gaza is not mentioned nearly enough. The besieging Gaza, and especially over the last few weeks, it has been noticeable by its absence in the mainstream press, at least. So thank you again for that. I'm sorry to say though that we've run out of time for this evening. And so I'm going to have to ask all of you to wait for a report on this evening's discussion, which should come out tomorrow, and to thank all of the contributors in particular for what they've said. It's been a very educating and even difficult evening. And yeah, personally, and on behalf of the organisation, I just want to thank you all again and wish you good night, as it is here in London.